Perfect.
All right. Oops, I'm sorry. I seem to be, I'm not on my first slide. Hello, everybody. I am happy to be here with the Michigan Wetlands Association, and thank you very much to Brianna for inviting me. I want to preface this by saying I am not an expert botanist, but I'm still learning all the time. And so I feel like my experience as someone who has occasionally been confused with these species might be helpful to others. I do want to say that I'm going to try to avoid a lot of technical botanical jargon. I will use a few terms that are technical, but I'm guessing that if you're someone who's really comfortable with botanical terms and all the jargon, you'll do very well looking these species up in the keys on your own. So what I'm really going to emphasize is, what are some things that you might see in the field? How can you really just gestalt these plants and start to get an intuitive sense for them? And of course, you should always back it up with technical field keys. And some of those photo ID apps are pretty darn good these days. So if you start with an app and then double check it with the key, I would recommend you do that. But I'm just going to try to give you some general sense of a group of species. So today, what I'd like to do is review some of the identifying characteristics that we use to recognize species. And I'm just going to give a whirlwind tour. I'm going to present 12 key wetland invasive species in Michigan, and some of those are woody, some are graminoid or monocot, and some are forbs. And partly because I'm covering the whole range, I really can't go into detail on those identifying characteristics for each group because they're a little bit different, but I'll give you a broad brush overview. For each of those species, I'm going to compare and contrast with some native lookalikes, species that might have some similarities, sometimes very similar, and other times just a real surface similarity. I'm hoping that you will also share your species recognition tips and your own list of worst wetland invasives, and I would encourage you to do that in the chat. My goal for today's talk is that you'll be better able to distinguish between invasive species and some similar looking natives in our wetlands. A quick overview of field characters to look for: growth form, twigs and buds on woody plants, leaf arrangement, and on woody plants, twig arrangement, vegetative characters, that's leaves and stems on herbaceous plants, flower and fruit characters. Other characters like tubers or rhizomes can be key, and then phenology, when a plant blooms, can actually make a difference. So just a quick overview of growth form, called in Michigan flora physiognomy, and in Michigan trees called habit. So for woody plants, you have tree, shrubs, and vine. And for herbaceous, you can have vines as well, but also forbs, grasses, sedges, and ferns. I'm not going to include any ferns, so we'll have forbs, grasses, and sedges. And be aware that for those herbaceous plants, they can be annual, biennial, and perennial, and that life history has some affects the characters. And so you'll see, especially with the biennials and perennials, whether they have basal rosettes or rhizomes or stems forming underground, that can be a key difference for some species. So a quick review of leaf and twig arrangement. I'm very old school here. I just did some scans of my copies of Michigan Trees and Newcomb's Wildflower Guides. On woody plants, alternate, opposite, and whorled are the key leaf arrangements. A few sneaky ones will do sub-opposite. And remember that in general, twig arrangement mirrors leaf arrangement. However, it's not perfect because sometimes those twigs just don't develop. So look at a number of twigs and kind of go by an average. Similar kinds of arrangement on forbs, on those herbaceous plants, but with the addition that there are forbs that have basal leaves only, even when they flower, or there are forbs that overwinter as a basal rosette and then send up a flowering stem. And then finally, grasses have a really different structure. I'm just showing it for you there. So you're really looking at different things like the leaf blade, the ligule, where the leaf meets the stem, and the sheath, and the node is those parts of the stem. from where the leaves emerge. So I'll use those terms pretty much in passing, but what I'll try to do is show you pictures when they're relevant. For those of you who know and love woody plants, you know that twigs are very characteristic, and winter tree ID can actually be as easy or easier sometimes than leaf-on conditions during the summer. Twigs have characteristic buds, leaf scars, and armaments, including prickle spines and thorns. I'm not going to show any leaf scars to distinguish invasives. That's not usually one that's actually needed. I didn't show in this sketch some bark characters such as and twig characters such as lenticels or the texture of bark, but I will bring those up where they're relevant. Again, some leaf shapes and types. Just a broad brush over here again. The key ones to be aware of are simple versus compound, the left two on that upper sketch, and then all kinds of leaf shapes, obviously on trees ranging from all shaped scale-like, needle-like leaves. And then on forbs, you can be toothed and lobed and divided in a range of different ways than woody plants are, but some are similar. Also, there are characters such as stipules, tendrils, and looking at those leaf bases, whether they're clasping or not. Again, here are some leaf margins that you should be aware of. Crenate, undulate, lobed, some leaf tips, acuminate and acute are pretty common. And then again, some variations for woody plants versus forbs, but those are some things to be looking for. And on grasses, as I said, the ligule especially, and the sheath as well as the bases. And on grasses, looking whether there are rhizomes or stolons can be really key. A few things about flowers, of course, you know, there are regular and irregular flowers, different numbers of petals, different inflorescence forms, and those yield different types of fruits. In general, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about flowers. In a few key species I will, but often if you have the flowers, that's your best chance at identifying the plants using the keys or field guides. And so more of my talk is going to focus on vegetative characters that you might find when the plants aren't blooming. Similarly, fruiting, especially in the fall, some fruits will persist and can be useful for quite a bit into the winter on the woody plants, but they're not always there. So good to learn some other vegetative characters. And then just a quick note on woody plants. It's important to be aware that there are two styles of woody plants. One is called monoecious, which means one house in Latin. Male and female flowers are on the same plant, which means that all mature individuals will actually have fruit. Whereas dioecious plants, that means two houses, have the male and female flowers on separate plants. And so only some of the mature plants will have fruit. So the reason that this is important for ID is that fruits can be diagnostic, but they're not always present. So just because a fruit isn't present doesn't mean that you should eliminate a species from consideration. So make sure you're looking at a sort of weight of average of all the characters you can look at. And then just a quick look at, you know, grass inflorescences are totally different with different forms and different terms, but just here's some a quick look at that. And then finally, I wanted to point out that there are sometimes other distinctive characters such as tubers and rhizomes and stolons, again, with the forbs and grasses, which can really be helpful sometimes in separating out plants that are annuals, for instance, versus perennials, and that will be key for some. I wanted to point out that phenology, actually, the difference in when plants burst bud or emerge, when they flower, when they seed, when the leaves senesce, and whether they have overwintering rosettes, all of those phenological differences can be a key between invasives and some of the native look-alike. So just be aware that for some species, that phenology is really important to be aware of. So I'm going to use some symbols to try to help make this clear. I'm calling these bell ringers. Bert Barnes, who wrote Michigan Trees, used to actually have a physical bell in his on his desk, and he would ring the bell whenever there was a really important concept. I'm not thinking that's going to work so well on Zoom, but I'm seeing that I kind of have the symbols might be hidden. There's my bell. So I'll try to put a bell when there's an important concept, but I'm also going to try to key you in a little bit to some of the key characters using these symbols. And I wasn't 100% consistent using these because sometimes the slides just got too crowded, but I tried to sort of highlight which things are the distinctive characters that allow you to differentiate between the invasive and the native. Oops, sorry. And then just a quick note on how how I chose species. I was trying to find the most common wetland invasives, but also the most commonly confused. And these are typically plants of forested and open wetlands, as well as floodplains. I didn't go for strictly aquatic plants, although some of these are emergent. And I just wanted to give a big shout out to Tony Resnicek of Michigan Flora and Phyllis Higman of Michigan Natural Features Inventory. I consulted both of them for their lists, my lists, and I did the best I could to pull in all that input. And I just also want to point out that what I have there on the right is the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network top reported species, and I'm going to cover a number of those. Obviously, I'm not going to cover stink bugs. Spotted knapweed is more an upland species, and Japanese knotweed, it is so distinctive. I think I can not cover it. So again, I'm trying to go for the things that are the most commonly confused. So here are the 3 key woody invasives I'm going to cover. I wanted to do more, but it turns out that all of these get so often confused that I wanted to make sure to go through a bunch of native lookalikes. And I think one of the reasons these are often confused is because these woody invasives they take up a lot of space. And so they're often what volunteer stewards are out there cutting down and trying to herbicide and get rid of. And so when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When volunteers have been trained, oh, here's glossy buckthorn, but not shown all the other things that it might look like, it can be really easy to go out there. You're so focused on getting rid of this plant that you're not even making the fine distinctions that maybe need to be made. So I'm not trying to diss anybody. I am very sympathetic. I myself occasionally have sometimes grabbed that wrong stem and made a quick look at it without really paying attention. So I'm just trying to make sure that we all can bring greater attention to looking carefully at those species, especially if we're out there trying to cut them down and get rid of them, because we don't want to cut the nice natives as well. So let's start with glossy buckthorn, now known as Frangula ulmus, previously known as Rhamnus frangula. It's actually been separated out from the other buckthorns. So this is a plant with entire simple leaves, oblong to elliptic. The margins are smooth, but they can be wavy, and they're tapered at the base and very clearly alternate. The tip can be rounded or it can be an abrupt point, but 2 really distinctive leaf characters are the strongly parallel veins and a very glossy upper surface, although the lower surface can be smooth or even somewhat hairy. Some other things that are really distinctive, of course, are the fruits. They start out greenish a bit and then quickly go to red. And as the season goes on, they ripen to a dark purple or even black, very shiny. And they're axillary rather than terminal, so they're held by the bases of the leaves. The bark has very prominent lenticels, as you can see from the photo here, and they tend to be vertical rather than horizontal, which is a contrast with some other species. The buds are covered with this dense golden brown fuzz, and that's really distinctive. So if you ever have a question, try to get a look at that bark. And I'm having a hard time putting this little green part in a place where you can see it, but I have some more buds here, and you can see the red fruit and the purple fruit. And then finally, again, that berry is red, ripening to the shiny black. So what are some things that you might confuse this with? Oops. Well, one of the common things people might confuse it with is chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa, which also grows in wetter settings. In this case, though, the leaves, although they're a similar shape, they're finely toothed. And in addition to those teeth, each of those teeth has a gland tip. And you'll also find some glands scattered along the midrib of the leaf. So if you have your 5 to 10 magnification hand loop, this will look really cool. Both those gland tip teeth, you can almost see them in the picture, and then the scattering of rusty glands along the rib. The fruit is actually a pome, not a berry. This is a member of the rose family, which is the same family as the apple family. So look at that little remainder of the flower parts there at the tip, like an apple has. So a different fruit if you see it, although the color is similar, it's that glossy, dark purple to blackish berry, but a different shape. The twigs are reddish to start, and then the bark can have lenticels, and you can see some scattered lenticels here, but typically as the plant matures, it smooths out to this lighter gray bark with only a few lenticels here and there, rather than those prominent lenticels on glossy buckthorn. And again, notice this bud totally lacking that dense golden brown fuzziness, and it's a very different color and texture here. Another look-alike is the photo that I started with of Michigan holly or winterberry, Ilex verticillatus. And you can see them side by side here. In this picture, you can see how different those leaves are. The shape is a little bit similar, but the Michigan holly here has fine upswept teeth all along the margin. Actually, if you hold the leaf parallel and look at it, you'll see that those teeth actually sweep up from the surface of the leaf. It's a sort of obovate leaf. That is, it's wider toward the leaf tip rather than being more or less a symmetrical oval. And it lacks the strong parallel veins. It has more of a netted venation. So those leaf characters are pretty distinctive. The fruit is never purple. Glossy buckthorn will start red, but it turns purple, whereas Michigan holly, those fruits just stay red. They're red when they're ripe. Now, it is important to note that this does have lenticels, just like very similar in appearance to glossy buckthorn. So always look closely. The branching structure is a little bit different, and as you start to look at growth form, you'll notice some form differences. But maybe an easier way to get a hold of this is to really look closely at those twigs and buds. The twigs are an olive gray color. They can have an almost waxy coating, and the buds are rounded. They lack that rusty fuzz. So making sure to look at several characters, the buds and twigs, as well as the leaves and fruit, will be very helpful for you. Some other glossy buckthorn native lookalikes that I'm just going to run through quickly, and I will leave it to you to go to the books and compare for yourselves. But these are things that I have seen people confuse in the field, or Phyllis Higman has seen people confuse in the field. So it's just good to be aware of the others that might be out there in similar settings. Our lovely native American hazelnut, Corylus americana, has prominent lenticels on the stem, so that can be confusing. However, it has very rounded buds. It has catkins as part of its fruiting structure. That's the male fruiting body. And then I didn't include, because I didn't quite have space, but the spring flowers, which are going to be out any minute now, like probably in 2 weeks, are the coolest little things. I strongly encourage you to look them up in your books and look in the field, because they're going to pop out, and way cool early spring flowers that are easy to miss because they're small, but you get your hand lens out and you will love them. If you have leaves, the leaf shape is very distinctive for hazelnut. Another that seems like it shouldn't be that confusing, but again, it has a similar shade of gray bark and may have some lenticels, so that although they kind of end up being more sort of vertical striping as the bark matures. But bladdernut, Staphylia trifolia, and it can be a very similar shade of gray again, but first of all, it's a compound leaf, not a simple leaf. So see, it's a 3-leaflet, which is what trifoliata means. And then starting in probably August and into the winter, and sometimes even through to the spring, you'll see the distinctive bladders hanging on the trees. This is the fruit. And inside that bladder, there will be anywhere from 1 to 5 or 6 hard round seeds. So very different fruit if you have the benefit of that. And then there are a bunch of native dogwoods, the Cornus species, our native shrubby dogwoods. They can have similar leaf venation, the strongly parallel leaves or veins on the leaves. However, key difference, they're opposite rather than alternate. And also remember that in many of our native dogwood shrub species, the fruits are terminal clusters rather than those one or several axillary fruits. So some key differences if you do have fruits. Shrub honeysuckles. This is such a huge and complicated set of species. I'm just going to do a broad rough coverage, because in the end, they seem to act fairly similarly in our wetland grading into upland settings. Some of them, Tatarica is probably more common in wetlands, whereas Macchiae is more common in uplands, but let's just go through these briefly. So Lonicera macchiae, Amur honeysuckle, Lonicera moroia, I think that's Moreau's honeysuckle, that hybridizes with Tatarica, which is Tatarian honeysuckle, and the hybrid is Hybrid bella. So all of these are large, densely growing shrubs with arched branches. And you can see on that lower photo how dense the growth can be. They have very slender twigs and almost inconspicuous buds. So again, there's some differences between these, and you can certainly learn all of them separately, but all of them have in common these slender twigs, kind of a light tan, and very inconspicuous buds. As they mature on the lower stems, and some of these can get to be the size of small trees in diameter. The bark is shreddy for Tatarica and more ridged, distinctively so for Macchiae. On all of them, the leaves are opposite, and the leaf shape is roughly elliptic, but on Macchiae, it's an acuminate that is a long pointed tip, whereas the others tend to be more acute or almost a bluntly pointed tip, depending on the species. There's some differences, again, in the leaf shapes and also in the hairiness of the leaf surfaces, but all of them have in common that they have these paired axillary flowers and fruits. So you can see our distinctive honeysuckle shaped flowers here, and then these paired fruits right in the axils of the leaves. And even after the fruits themselves have fallen off, sometimes the peduncles, those little stems that hold the fruits, will remain in place. So you can sometimes, even without fruit, see this pattern. And then another really key characteristic for these species is the early bud burst and late senescence. That is, they get green early in the spring and they stay green late in the fall. You can, if you go out in October, you can just pick them out because all the natives will have lost their leaves by then, but these will still be green. And that there's a super interesting story for why that's the case, but I don't think I have time to go into that. So what are some natives that you might confuse this with? Well, of course, we do have some native honeysuckles, including Lonicera canadensis and Lonicera dioica. And I am so sorry, I have forgotten to include the common names. I think Lonicera canadensis is Canadian fly honeysuckle, or Canadian honeysuckle, and dioica is maybe fly. Well, you can look up the common names. I'm sorry, I didn't include those. But the key difference for both of those is that they're just smaller plants overall with much more spare growth. They're low growing. They don't get to be these big sprawling shrubs with their branches arcing everywhere. And the fruits are in general much more sparse. Same pattern of paired fruits, and look at the length of that peduncle. But look overall, much more sparse. You don't see that dense pattern of fruiting with every single leaf axil having the paired fruits. So if you are in a place where you see some really small honeysuckles, you should double check that it's not one of the natives. Another thing that sometimes people will confuse this for is elderberry, Sambucus canadensis, and Sambucus rubra, mainly because that's another opposite shrub. So yes, the twigs are opposite, but they're much stouter and they have really big buds and prominent lenticels. So if you just look at those twigs without leaves, really clear differences from the slender, delicate, light tan twigs of the honeysuckles. Overall, the branching and the growth is less dense. Here it looks dense because of all the leaves that are on it, but if you see it without the leaves, it's going to look much more spare overall. Really key difference, and one of the things that makes this look so densely leafed is that it has compound leaves. Okay, so these leaflets, you can see that whole thing is a leaf there with many leaflets. And then finally, here it's really obvious if you see it anytime from when it starts to bloom and say late June, early July until it's fruiting into August, you'll see these terminal clusters of flowers or fruit versus the axillary fruits held at every stem there. I'm just going to quickly pose some other lookalikes that have opposite leaf arrangement. Again, these are things that I've seen people confuse with the shrub honeysuckles, but I just didn't have time and space to list every single one, so I'll just run over these. We have a number of native viburnum species, including maple leaf viburnum, Viburnum acerifolia, nannyberry, Viburnum lentego, and American hivebush cranberry, which is Viburnum trifolium. All of those have terminal versus, well, I should stop. Not all of them. Most of them have terminal versus axillary flowers and fruit, or at least clusters that are more than two. And I would just urge you, if you look these up in your guides, to compare the bark and leaf shaped. A number of the viburnums have lobed leaves, and even those that are not lobed have distinctive twigs and buds. Shrub dogwoods are natives, including silky dogwood, Cornus amomum, Cornus femina, or now racemosum, which is gray dogwood, and Cornus strigosus. I think that's red osier dogwood, and I might not have kept up with the latest name. Those do have similar opposite branching, but in general, the twigs are a bit starter and often the coloration is very different. But if you do have leaves, the strong parallel veins are really key. And if you only have the twigs, the buds are really distinctive. Cornus, the name is related to the word for goat, and the buds, the lateral buds on a cornus twig look like goat horns, just like little goat horns. And so these are much more distinctive buds than those slender, almost, unobtrusive buds on the honeysuckles. Ash saplings, the main reason these get confused is because we have a lot of little bitty ashes. Our big ashes have died, but there's still a seed bank, or also there are a lot of seedlings that are getting browsed repeatedly and kept low. So we have a lot of little ashes that might look shrubby. Really key differences, the twigs of ash, because it has compound leaves, the twigs are really stout. The terminal buds are big and blunt. And many of the ash seedlings that you might see in the understory are affected by a flower gall mite. So they'll have this growth that seems to be all over around the buds that is just nothing like what you would see on a honeysuckle. And then finally, I'll just say bladdernut, Staphylia trifoliata, which I pointed out before, is sometimes confused because it's alternate. Again, it does have compound leaves, which is really key, and it can have some distinctive lenticels. So if you see the bark or obviously the fruits, you'll know not to confuse it. Common buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica. This used to be considered more of an upland thing, but it has really moved into our wetlands big time. It's a small tree with dense branching and often has terminal thorns or thorns that are branches. So you can see the thorns here. And they can be kind of hidden inside under the buds, or they can be sticking out. And if you work with buckthorn, you will be getting jabbed a lot. Sometimes the dense sapling stands that grow where there's such a strong seed rain can appear like a clonal shrub, or sometimes, again, when they're young, they will be deer browsed and kind of kept short, although the deer tend to avoid them as they get older. Some things you'll notice, again, the strong veining on the leaves and somewhat toothed. But here's where common buckthorn just doesn't follow any of the rules. It is anywhere from alternate to something called subopposite. So you can see that's kind of alternate. It's almost opposite, and sometimes it will actually be opposite. So it's all over the map. One thing distinctive about Rhamnus cathartica is that it has these short shoots, and that's where they're actually twigs that have had successive generations of leaves growing on them. So this is just a little short stubby twig, and that's actually really similar to some fruit trees, such as apple trees and pear trees. And in fact, pear trees can have thorns, and I did not include the calorie pear, which is now an invasive, but a little bit more in uplands. So you might sometimes confuse them with that, but the dark buds are pretty distinctive from those fruit trees. A really key thing that everybody knows is those purple to blackberries linger late into the winter. Rhamnus cathartica, the berries have a cathartic effect. It's actually used medicinally sometimes. But apparently it's cathartic for the birds too, because when they do finally eat them late in the winter, they tend to poop them out, and that's starlings and common buckthorn have marched hand in hand across the landscape, starting in the east. There was a great paper in Ontario about that in the 90s. Outer bark is really dark and can get, I didn't show pictures of the bark, but I'm sure many of you are familiar. It can get kind of scaly. But if you cut a buckthorn, the inner wood is often orange and the roots can be quite orange. So that's pretty distinctive. And like honeysuckle, it tends to bloom pretty early. It actually has green flowers and it stays green late. So another thing that hangs onto those leaves late into the fall. Something I should mention is that this is a dioecious species, so not every plant will have fruits. And the good news is if you're actually trying to eliminate invasives, you can focus on the females, the ones that have fruit, and just leave the males behind. So it's only half the work because those males are not going to produce fruit. What are some things that you might confuse it for? We do have a native buckthorn, Rhamnus alnifolia, the alderleaf buckthorn. And the leaves can look fairly similar, although they're more painted. However, it has a really cool feature that I haven't really talked about, which is the stipule at the leaf base. This is like a little leaflet, or it starts as kind of a scale for where the bud emerges. And there it is, this little really distinctive feature of the native leaf as opposed to the non-native. But the other really key thing is growth form. This is a really well-behaved little shrub. It rarely gets more than 3 feet tall, and it's a clonal shrub, so it'll spread out in patches, but it's not the dense, dark, overtaking growth that it characterizes common buckthorn. Something that you might confuse it for if you're just looking at twigs and buds, and oops, I'm trying to move this again so you can actually see my bud pictures there. You might confuse it with wild black cherry, Prunus serotina, or potentially even Prunus virginiana, the choke cherry, which are two of our native cherry species. Keep in mind that both of those lack thorns, and they're going to be very clearly alternate, not this wild alternate, subopposite, almost opposite kind of form. The buds in general are lighter in color and can have an almost waxy coating, and they typically, Prunus species have a kind of bitter almond smell when you scratch them. So if you like to do scratch and sniff twigs, and I know some people don't smell the characters and don't want to use those, but for other people, those scratch and sniff twigs can be really helpful. And then I showed the chokeberry before, but again, just to highlight here, the chokeberry, Aronia melicarva, can have really reddish twigs and buds, again, strongly alternate, and again, lacking thorns. And another that I didn't actually pull out photos for, but one to check, I think the growth form overall looks quite different, but our native hawthorn critique is a number of different and readily hybridizing and sort of difficult to distinguish from each other, but they're also small trees with thorns, but they tend to have a little different growth form, and their fruits, if you see them, look like little apples. Again, they're in the rose family, so they're pomes, so they're not going to be those dark purple berries, but they're going to be little pomes, and often in clusters rather than those axillary groups. Okay, oops, I went the wrong way. Here are some other woody invaders that people were lobbying to have on the list, and I just didn't think I could cover everything. So a few things that I'll encourage you to look for yourself for compare and contrast. Japanese barberry, Berberis thunbergii. Phyllis and Tony differed on whether that should be included, but Phyllis thinks this one is going to town in some of their especially forest floodplain systems, and moving into some other moist systems can be incredibly invasive. But the main thing you're going to confuse that with is their native Ribes cynospedy prickly gooseberry. And there's some pretty clear differences. The gooseberry has prickles as well as spines. Black alder, Ulmus glutinosa, is a tree that's often a river floodplain tree, can move into wetter areas. Compare that to our native alder, Ulmus ancanna, which is actually a shrub more than a tree. And then the lenticels on it can look somewhat like the corylus or hazelnut species. Rosa multiflora rose can invade just about anywhere, it seems. And certainly I have it a lot along my swamp edge. So it's not necessarily considered a swamp species, but it's certainly getting into wet places. So compare that to our native Rosa species, especially Rosa palustris and Rosa satigera. The thorns and prickles are different. If you have leaves, the leaves and stipules are different. Obviously, if you actually have the fruits, multiflora, it's a group of multiple flowers and thus multiple small fruits that's quite distinctive. You might also compare this to our native rubus species that can have a similar twig color, especially wild black raspberry, Rubus occidentalis. Elaeagnus umbellata has been considered to be a species of dry uplands, but boy, it can move into wetlands as well. And I've seen it growing in the middle of fallen logs, right in the middle of a very wet vernal pond. So it seems to be pretty widespread in its habitat. The main thing to compare this to is our native shrub willows, Salix species, and the scales are really distinctive on this. And then finally, Viburnum opulus gilder rose compared to our native Viburnum trilobum. I'm seeing I'm running a little behind, so I'm going to just zip through this next round because I do want to leave some time for questions. So some invasive graminoids, and these are grasses, but I'm also including a monocot, excuse me, reed, which is Phragmites australis, subspecies australis. We have a native, which is no longer considered a separate species, but which is a different subspecies, that is subspecies Americanum. You will know this by the silky beard on the axis of the spikelets, which gives it this dense, fuzzy look to the seed heads. These are tall and stout plants, usually over 1.5 meters tall, big old wide leaf blades. And the ligule, I'll show you on the next slide, has a densely ciliate brown band. So like I said, we do have a native subspecies, Americanus. A key difference in form is that the invasive tends to be dense colonies versus these scattered stems of the native. The invasive has yellowish brown stems versus look at these distinctive reddish lower stems on the native. And talk about drive-by ID. I was driving through northern Minnesota last fall, and this was one you could pick out on the roadsides, just see those red stems and then the less dense seed heads as you were driving by. Here is the difference in the ligules on the native versus the non-native. And again, so the sheaths persist on the native plant, but they fall away on the non-native. And then although the actual glooms, the seeds are smaller on the non-native, the seed heads are actually denser. And then a final difference, which is interesting in the phenology, is that the native is actually later to flower and bloom. The non-native is, in contrast to some of those shrubs that we saw where the non-natives were early, these actually flower and bloom later. Reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinacea. I was gobsmacked to read that in the latest edition of Michigan Flora, this is no longer considered non-native. It's considered an aggressive wetland invader, but it's native, but it has hybridized with weedier species or types that were brought in from Europeans. So it's considered to have weedier races. It's a cool season grass, 2 to 6 feet tall, rhizomatous. The stem is hairless, hollow, and smooth. The leaves are wide, tapering, and up to 10 inches long, and this is often in moist soils and such as stream banks. Two of the things that, or one of the things that you might really confuse this with is our native blue joint grass, or Calamagrostis canadensis, because that's the other grass that grows widely in a similar kind of setting. Some really distinctive things are the ligule on the blue joint grass. So look at that, that ligule, and it really persists there. Whereas on reed canary, the ligule is thin and it lacks hairs and it's often kind of folded under. Bloom time differs. So reed canary is early in the summer or late spring. So if you go out in July and you see a grass that's just starting to put out its seeds versus a grass that already has brown seed heads, the reed canary grass finishes up early and it's going to be brown already by midsummer. Whereas the natives are much later. And another native to look for in the seed heads are very distinctive if you see them, but Elamis species, our native ryegrasses, can come into light patches and look like a dense stand of a thickly or a wide-leafed grass, and you might be concerned that it's reed canary grass, but that doesn't even get started blooming until August or something. So if you see seed heads in it in June, July, that's not going to be Elamis. So check the Elamis species. Also compared to, in some cases, people get confused with long-awned woodgrass. Wild rice occasionally has a little bit of a similar look, or wood reedgrass and Arundinacea. Cattails. The narrow-leafed cattail, Typha angustifolia, is non-native. We have a native, and the native hybridizes with the non-native to form hybrid glauca. So a couple of key characters are the pistillate staminate flowers on this invasive are separated by some stems. It's like two hot dogs on a stick, roasting on a stick. And the leaves are narrower. Somebody pointed out to me that this just seems unusual. Like in almost all cases, it seems like the invasives are the really big, beefy ones. So just remember that in this case, it's the native that has the broader leaves. And then this is a really key character that this, the leaf sheath has what's called an auricle. So this area here, and it continues above the tip of the sheath. So it's a prominent auricle. So compared to our native, you can see the sheath doesn't continue up that way. There's no separation between the staminate and pistillate flowers. They just kind of grade one to the other. So it's like a big beefy hot dog on a stick that then just kind of fades out toward the tip. The leaves tend to be broader, and this can be a pretty well-behaved plant, just kind of sparsely mixed in with others rather than in a dense stand. However, if nitrogen and phosphorus runoff is high, even the native can become pretty dense. And also remember that there is that hybrid with the non-native. So you can see intermediate characters, and it might be the hybrid. Really important bell ringer here on the comparison with iris species. And the reason I want to point this out is that if flowers and fruits are not present, you should be aware of this, because Typha, cattail roots rhizomes are edible and have long been used by as a food source by Native Americans, and many people today still like to harvest them as edibles. And iris, in contrast, is not edible. It's considered toxic, although low-dose tinctures are available and sold, but you wouldn't want to go out and eat the whole tuber. So really key difference is that the iris leaves are emerging from the base in a kind of flat fan-shaped shape, whereas the cattails have leaf sheaths and auricles, as you'll see even here. Japanese stilt grass, a new invader, this is a nasty one. Both ends of the leaf are pointed. There's a prominent midrib, but it's asymmetrical down the leaf. Tends to have smooth margins. The leaves are well spaced along the stem, kind of looking almost ladder-like if you go up the stem. The roots are thin and weak because this is an annual grass. So the best way to compare this to other possibly native grasses is to just pull one out. There are rootlets or stilt roots descending from the lower nodes, and sometimes the plant's very floppy, it flops over and it sprawls and it will root in like that. So it's considered a sprawling annual. Again, when you pull out that root, no rhizomes. And there are sometimes some hairs right below the leaf sheath. It has a delicate raceme of 1 to 3 spikes. Something that can look a lot like it is our native whitegrass, Learsia virginica, but the leaves on Learsia are longer and thinner, and they don't have that midrib stripe. And they might even look like they have a midrib, but it's not going to be asymmetrical. The stems in general are more upright. The flower head and seed head is much more spreading and open and may have more than 3 spikes, as you can see here. But a really key difference, pull it up. It's a perennial with well-developed roots, rhizomes, and you'll see the new stems waiting to grow next right here, often at the base. Similarly, Nimblewill, Muhlenbergia, Schreiberi can be sort of look somewhat similar because it's also decumbent and mat forming, and it may root at the nodes, but the leaves are much narrower, again, not having that stripe. The leaves are held at a really sharp angle from the stem, not quite as upright. And the flower spike is just a single spike. It's much longer and it's finer. Some other things to compare: panic grass, dicanthelium, crabgrass, digitaria, and even a non-grass species, some polygonum species such as smartweed can have a similar look to the leaf. So check those out for yourself. I wanted to get to flowering rush, which is not a rush at all. It's actually a very primitive member of the lily family, as you'll see from the look of this flower, and it's most closely related to water plantain, Alyssma species, if you're familiar with that. So if you see this in bloom, you're not going to have any doubt that this is not a rush. It has these pink flowers, 3 petals, it has an umbel. That umbel is what can trip you up when this is not in bloom. And also, if you see the leaves without any flowering stems, the vegetative characters can be confusing. So let's look at a few things that you might see. So compared to our native hardstem bulrush, the stems of bulrush are round in cross-section, whereas if you cut through a flowering rush, it would be triangular. And also you can see here's that, maybe it looks like an umbel, but it always has the leaves pointing up and surpassing the flower clusters rather than having a straight umbrella-shaped cluster. Giant burrweed, again, if you see it in flower, you're going to notice those really distinctive flowers. But if you just see the vegetation, it has a similar rib and can look a little bit similar in cross section, but it's not twisted. So if you look at, I think I didn't show that carefully, but if you look at these leaves, they tend to twist as you go up the tip. So look for the twisted leaves for the flowering rush. Another native that you might confuse vegetatively, again, not when you see that really distinctive flower, but if you just see the vegetation, you might confuse it with sweet flag, Acarus americanum. But Acarus, the leaves lack the prominent midvein and instead have 2 to several more or less prominent veins. So that's going to be a really key difference to look for with vegetation. And also it emits a really sweet smell when crushed. And then another native you might confuse it with when not in bloom is lake sedge, which does have a similar kind of triangular cross section to the flowering rush, but has this really distinctive ladder-like pattern of fibers at the base and turning red. The bases will turn quite red. If you see it in bloom or fruit, you're not going to confuse it. So in the couple minutes I have left, I'm going to just zoom through some of these invasive forbs. I will make this presentation available as a handout if you want to request it after, because I know I'm going really fast on these. The forbs are really important, but I think at least the first three are really quite familiar. People have spent a lot of time looking at purple loosestrife, garlic mustard, and Dame's rocket, so I'll go through those quickly, but I just do want to highlight especially this lesser celandine or fig buttercup, and then marsh thistle. So purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria, opposite to whorled, the entire upper part of the plant is densely hairy, so that can be really key, including the leaf margins. The flowers are in really dense spikes. They're usually pink to fuchsia, but some are lighter and some can get to almost a bluish color. So that's where you might confuse them with at least one other native. The axillary clusters are really quite tightly packed. And the stem, and this is where I think it can be confusing if you see it only vegetatively, the stem actually can get woody with age and can seem rather angled. A couple things that might look similar, blue vervain, Verbena hastata, can actually have it's more typically a bluish purple, but can have actually a rose colored or pink flower and similar flower heads, but typically not as dense a flower head, single flowers per cluster. And then look at these leaves, a much longer leaf that's toothed and may have a lobe or two at the base, and the stem is not at all angled. Our native winged loosestrife, Lythrum elatum, can be confusing. Let me move this here. It will have clearly distinctive wings or ridges, but purple loosestrife can have a little bit of that, but mainly the stems are hairless. If you see the hairless stem, you'll know. And then the flowers tend to be single within the axil here, rather than densely packed 2 or more clusters in each axil of the spike. So overall, the flower head looks like a much less dense spike. Some other native lookalikes include fireweed, whorled loosestrife, and wild mint. Whorled loosestrife mainly because it gets kind of woody at the base or semi-woody. Fireweed, if you look at all the vegetative characters, and certainly if you have the flower, that will be distinctive. Garlic mustard, Alliaria petiolata, probably lots of you know this really well. I'm going to focus mainly on the fact that because this is a biennial, it overwinters as a basal rosette of round to kidney-shaped leaves with scalloped margins, which can look like a number of other things that grow in wetland settings. For instance, a number of different violet species will have that kind of rounded or kidney-shaped leaf, but many violets are rhizomatous. So you'll see a big, thick root rather than a much slenderer root of the biennial garlic mustard, or they'll actually be stemmed. So the leaves will be growing off a stem rather than in a basal cluster. Another that can be really confusing is ragwort, especially Senecio aurea, but there are even Senecio, let's see, the round leaf ragwort can be confusing sometimes. So the leaf margins can be toothed in the same way, but they come to little bitty tips, which is really distinctive on Senecio. And overall, if you look at this lane, the veins are less netted. Look at the way that garlic mustard, a really distinctive network of veins on the leaf, and much less so on the Senecio. Dame's rocket, another biennial with a really distinctive basal rosette, big tall plant. The flowers change in color over time. It's really pretty distinctive and very aromatic. If you walk by it, you'll be able to tell. The main thing that people confuse it with is our little native wild blue phlox, Phlox divaricata. Now, if you see them in bloom, it should be very obvious because phlox has 5 petals versus 4 on the Dame's rocket. 2 other distinctive differences. Phlox has opposite leaves versus on the flowering stems, Dame's rocket will have alternate leaves. And there's no basal rosette on phlox. It's a perennial, but it just sends up stems rather than having that big, beefy basal rosette. Just a quick aside on another non-native look-alike to in growth form to Dame's rocket, there's a new up-and-coming invasive called money plant or Lunaria annua to be aware of. I just wanted to spend a minute here on lesser celandine or fig buttercup, now called Ficaria verna, previously Ranunculus ficaria. It looks very buttercup-like, and it does have a basal rosette. Crenate leaves with or crenate to entire leaves that are heart-shaped or kidney-shaped. And you can see these are really long petioles, longer than the leaves. The flowers it's typically more than 1 flower per stem, though this is showing only 1 yellow flower with 8 to 12 petals. So really prominent bell ringer though on this forms tubers, and that will be really obvious in the field because this can just absolutely carpet forest floodplains and other moist settings, but those tubers are going to be really key. You might possibly confuse it, and I'm sorry, this photo seems to have overwritten my text here, but with small flowered buttercup Ranunculus abortivus when it's in the rosettes. But compare those leaves on your own. And then another species is Tussilago farfara. But in Tussilago, the flowers actually come out before the leaves do. So by the time you find those leaves, which do look like they're in a rosette, you're going to see the dead and dying flowers. So that's going to be a really key difference. Oh, sorry. And here and there, I have point out the phenology difference will be very key. Finally, just briefly, marsh thistle, Cirsium palustris. The combination of small flower heads and prickly stem makes this distinctive compared to other native invasive species as well as natives. So let's look at a couple of those. Our native swamp thistle, Cirsium muticum, has big flower heads, and the outer part of the involucre is actually, it's sticky. Now you want to be careful testing that because if it's not swamp thistle, some of the non-natives that have big flower heads are really prickly, such as bull thistle, but Cirsium muticum can be really distinctive, certainly those really big flower heads. If you see a really big flower head, it's not the non-native marsh thistle. Although bull thistle, another non-native, does have big flower heads, and there you'll have to compare vegetative characters. And then one of our really nasty invasives, Canada thistle, Cirsium arvense, has similar small flower heads, but not quite as prickly or bristly a stem. A few other invasive forb species, some of these up and coming that you'll want to take a look at: great hairy willow herb, giant hogweed, common valerian. We have some valerian native species, but the common one is spreading widely. And I'm not even sure it's in Michigan yet, but people are really worried about mile-a-minute weed, which is in the buckwheat family and can grow really fast. Here are some resources I'd highly recommend. Michigan Flora I used as a source for many of the photos. Michigan Invasive Species Network. I think I had sent out to everybody these 2 field guides, one from Michigan Natural Features and DNR, the Field Guide to Invasives, and a Wisconsin fact sheet. And just wanted to thank and acknowledge again, Tony Rosencheck and Phyllis Higman for species selection and ID tips. Brianna, thank you so much for coordinating and troubleshooting. And then I just wanted to say, I kind of started this whole process of trying to think of these comparisons back when I had the privilege of being a woody plants instructor. And every time students missed something, I compiled a list of trouble twigs. And then I did a similar kind of presentation on woody invasives versus natives for the city of Ann Arbor back in 2019. And that was kind of the seed for this talk. And Amy Lipson at that time offered some suggestions of things that people confused. So I will stop there for questions. I know I've taken a lot of time here, and but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. This was a lot of information and very helpful, so we really appreciate it. We do have a couple questions. If you guys want to stay on, feel free. One question was, are native honeysuckles fairly abundant in Michigan? And then a follow-up question was, are native and non-native honeysuckles frequently found together? So it kind of goes together.
You know, that's a really good question. The native honeysuckles can be locally abundant, but compared to the non-natives, I would say they don't seem very abundant, at least in the field sites in southern lower Michigan where I work. Now, maybe other participants can share their own experience in the chat, but and are they frequently found together? Again, they can grow in some similar sites. I think at least Lonicera dioica is more typically an upland species, but it can be in moist sites. So that's not, I have not seen them together often, but sometimes. I know that's a really hand-waving response.
No, I think that's true though. I mean, a lot of times I don't really see them as frequently together, but there is obviously the habitat overlap too. So I think you answered that pretty good. Another question is, I believe reed canary grass is still considered a native in Michigan. Do you think it should be considered invasive, non-native because of the hybridization? It seems to really take over wetlands and choke out other species. I have seen it listed as an invasive in other states.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was alluding to, that I was surprised when I went back to just review this in Michigan flora that is now considered a native. But if you read carefully what Michigan flora says, they believe that there are some weedy European races that have mixed and mingled with our native. And it is considered a very aggressive in some sites, to the extent that the state of Minnesota has characterized it as creating biological deserts. When you have reed canary grass invading in, it is a biodiversity of everything goes way down. Tree establishment is really difficult. You get very few insects, very few forbs. So I think it's a complicated dance of, there seems to be hybridization that has created this much more aggressive weedy race. And, you know, disturbed soils are often where it comes in, and especially moist disturbed soils. So there may be some site factors that are contributing to it being especially aggressive and weedy. So yes, it is technically considered a native in Michigan, although with a C value of 0. And it can be so aggressive and weedy that many natural area managers do try to get rid of it.
Okay, thank you. There is just a couple other questions, one of which copy of your presentation if you're okay with that, and then we can share it with the attendees.
Yes, I'll share it with MWA and it can go out from there.
Thank you. And then one more question. Amy Lipson, she says native honeysuckles are much more common in northern Michigan. So that was just an
Exactly.
added
Thank you,
comment.
Amy. Yeah, I think you're lucky to be up north now where you get to see them. I've seen them occasionally in your old haunts in Ann Arbor, but not a lot.
All right. Oh, one more. Yeah, I got another comment on that too. Native honeysuckles are mostly up north in Michigan. Other than the native vines, natives not much found in southern Michigan, and that was Ketogeicus.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That jives with my experience, but I haven't spent nearly as much time up north, so appreciate that.
All right. I think those are all the questions that are available right now. We really appreciate your talk today. It was so informative, and it just having those excellent photos comparisons was really great. So we really appreciate that. And thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. We'll be in touch. Bye, Jacqueline.
Bye-bye.